I want to get started, and so first I want to welcome everybody who's here, including especially the people who are new, who haven't been here before. I don't know if anybody here, I think maybe everybody here has been here before. I'm not sure if there's anybody who's new. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, this is part 2 of a series in political philosophy on the idea of electoral representative democracy, and each of those is a concept by itself. And we have started already last time, part 1, to talk about the democracy part. We discussed what is democracy, what the alternatives are, and what kind of arguments can be made in favor of democracy. But why is it better than the others? I mean, a lot of us are probably brought up to believe that it is obviously better, but it's not clear that it is. I mean, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I think there is a good argument to suggest, which we talked about last time, for why it is, but it's when you stop and look at it closely, it's not clear that people really want democracy. If they really understood what it meant, they might not want it. But even so, there are good arguments. I think the best argument is the Kantian one, that democracy is even if it's inefficient and even ineffective, it still does the greatest amount of shows the greatest amount of respect and honor to the people who are governed, that they're given a genuine voice in how their lives are going to be structured by the laws and policies of the societies in which they live. They should have a voice in it. And as opposed to the alternatives, the two alternatives are autocracy ruled by one, and oligarchy ruled by a subset of the governed, but not all of it, but more than one. And those are the alternatives. Really, it's either ruled by one, ruled by some, or ruled by all. And there really aren't too many other logical alternatives. But there are different kinds of democracies, and there are different kinds of oligarchies in between, and different kinds of autocracies. There's kings, dictators, and tyrants, and benevolent monarchs. But those are details we talked about last time. So we're proceeding now on the assumption that democracy is desirable, it is defensible, and we should have it. So the next part of the problem is the representative part, and that's what we're going to be focusing on this time. And just there are problems with democracy itself, but we talked about most of those last time. There are problems with representation, which is what we're going to be focusing on this time. Next time, we get to the electoral part and problems with voting in elections, and there's really serious problems there. And then I think that'd be part 3, and then there probably will be a part 4 in which I talk about power concentrations and corruption, because that's the thing we're constantly, it's threatening to degrade whatever form of government you happen to have. And then finally, and in the 5th and final part, we talk about, well, what can be done about it? What can we do to make things better, assuming you're not perfectly happy with the way things are? Apparently, a lot of people are not. So what are the options? What can we do? And there really are only 2 that I'm aware of, and we'll talk about that later. One of them is very familiar to people. It's one we've all heard 1,000 times before, and that's reform. Why don't we just fix what we have? Cut out things like have campaign finance reform, gerrymandering, and all the things that we've all heard before about how to fix the system we have. Well, there are some interesting arguments that suggest that those don't work, and frankly can't work because the system is not conducive to those things working. But we could argue about that, and we'll get to that in that final part. But finally, there is an alternative to this that has never been tried on, as far as I know, on a scale of like a major nation. It's been tried locally, but that simply ditches the idea of elections altogether and talks about a different kind of representative democracy that involves random selection from the community at large of the people who make the laws. In other words, doing away with elected representatives of any kind. But he's still maintaining representation in a different form than we currently have, and still respecting democracy. And it's sometimes called sortition or lotocracy. And there's a lot of interesting this is sort of like the cutting edge of political philosophy and political science right now. And it's very, very, very dramatically, radically different from what we have in many ways. And many people don't even know what it is, let alone approve of it. And I'm sure there's going to be tons of objections about it, but there are answers to those objections. So that's what we're moving toward. And it may not work, and it's got its own set of problems. But what I've been doing, have done last time, this time, and the next time, 2 times, is trying to draw attention to the fact that there's enough wrong with the systems we have now that something ought to be done. That there is a problem and it's growing, and because if you don't see that problem, you won't see the necessity for any kind of change, even if it's radical change, which is where we're heading to when we get to that last topic, autocracy or sortition. So anyway, but today we're going to back up to that problems with representation. What are they? There's a bunch of them, but one of them that I want to focus on has to do with just the very idea of it. What exactly are we doing when somebody represents somebody else? In the write-up, I discussed this at length, and I'm not going to be talking about necessarily everything in the write-up, but those of you who want to pursue it can look it up. And if there's something if you have done the write-up and there's something that you want to talk about, I'm going to be pausing frequently to open it up for questions and discussion. But I do want to start with this first idea, first problem, and that is representation. Okay, here's the core of the problem. How do you get in a representative democracy of the electoral kind? You're trying to get we can't do direct democracy for vote. Well, in theory nowadays perhaps we could. That's where everybody votes on everything. Technology like what we're using right now makes that theoretically possible, that maybe everybody in the country could get together every Saturday morning and make the laws that are going to govern that country and cut out the middleman, the senators, representatives. We make the laws. There are problems with that, even though technologically maybe that's not crazy anymore. It probably was at one point in history, but we talked about that last time. But assuming we're going to have representatives, how does that happen? How do you get? Here's the core of the problem. There are, I forget exactly how large the electorate, the eligible voters are in the United States, but it's upwards of 100 million, 330 million population, but not all of them can vote. A lot of them are minors. I think somewhere around 200 million who theoretically could vote. Everybody has an opinion about how government should run. And there must be, I'm not saying that there are 200 million different ways to run the country, but there are certainly vastly different and a vastly large number of different ways to run the country. And somehow the whole thing gets reduced to you're either a Republican or a Democrat. And it seems like we're cutting out a lot of stuff to get it reduced back to two. I mean, what kind of choice is that? It's like if you went to a restaurant and there's only 2 items on the menu, and hot dogs or hamburgers, and that's it. I suppose you still have freedom of choice, you still have a voice, but it's not quite that's a pretty truncated idea of having a voice. This is what you must choose between this party and that party. There are many nuances about different ways of looking at the world, and many people have. To give it a good example of this, is that many people are socially conservative on some issues, but economically liberal at the same time, or the reverse, economically conservative, but socially liberal. In fact, the study by Martin Gilens, which we talked a little bit about last time, and there's a link to it. He's a political scientist who studied American political opinion for several decades, had this rather striking presentation where he presented the results of his study of public opinion in the United States and how it tracks or doesn't track with what the government does. And the short answer is it doesn't track at all. Only 10% of the population, in other words, what 90% of people want is not what government does. But there is a 10% of the population that does reflect what government does, and that's the upper 10%, 10 percentile of the income distribution. So in other words, if you've got money, government listens to you. If you don't, it doesn't. It's that simple. However, there's another side issue which is relevant here. And that is, in the course of analyzing all this data from decades and decades of surveys, they discovered that most Americans actually, if government did reflect what they want, we would have a government that's far more socially conservative than the one we do have right now, because most Americans are more socially conservative than their government is. And this shows up on issues like gay marriage, abortion. Most Americans are on the conservative side. However, they're also economically more liberal than what the government is. If they had their way, we would have universal basic health care, for everyone. We would have higher minimum wage. We would have more economic support. These are all liberal economic issues, and most Americans are in favor of that. So they don't break down into you have a conservative people here who are conservative on both social and economic issues, and over here you've got those who are liberal on both. That's not how it breaks down if you look at the numbers from the average American population. So, and there's all kinds of gradations in there, a lot of subtlety in there that just isn't reflected in the political choices we have right now. So what happens, and why does that happen? Why do potentially a vast number of different ways to different opinions about what government should be get reduced to just two? Well, there was back in the it was a French sociologist named I may be mistaken his name, but it was early in the 20th century, who did a study of this, found that in electoral democracies, this happens inevitably. I think it's called Duverger's law. And it happens because the efficiencies of, it just becomes unworkable to have like 30, 40, 50, or 100 different political parties out there in every election. People, they deliberately want to, there's a tendency to coalesce, to erase as many differences as you can between people and make them more homogeneous and simplify it, and that's part of the process of an electoral democracy. It's just maybe human beings can't handle such complexity where you have 100 different parties or 100 different candidates. And so in order to get participation, get people involved, think of a sporting event where you have one team versus another. Imagine a sporting event where there's 40 teams vying each other. It's hard for people to track that. So there's a tendency to simplify to one versus one. And this is a social psychological phenomenon. It's been noted by people who study that. So that's part of the reason. But to get back to the notion, the problem is, what does that have to, in what sense is that democratic? If your choices are reduced to two, I guess that's better. It's better than no choice at all, but it's only better by one. It's like as I mentioned in the write-up, it's about as close to having no choice at all as you can get without actually having no choice at all. And this is a conceptual problem with representation that seems unavoidable, at least if we're going to insist on voting or elections as the way to, or what's known as proxy representation, when you find someone who represents a large group of people. Reducing choices down to two seems to be a social psychological artifact of elections that interferes with their real with the understanding of what democracy is supposed to be. It's supposed to be where people have a voice in their government. If your voice has to be reduced to one of these two things, and you don't fit, suppose you don't like either one of the two choices you're offered, what happens to you? You become, well, one of two things. You become either indifferent to politics, you stop voting, you stop caring, or you become some sort of activist and or trying to overthrow the government either peacefully or otherwise, but that you don't fit. You're dissatisfied. There's dissatisfaction, so that's one of the major problems with representation. There's other things too, but I want to pause right now and see what people want to say to this so far. I see two hands. I see Bill and John. Bill, you want to go ahead and talk?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. Can I be heard?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that Verger's law is based on a more specific causal mechanism than you mentioned, which is this. Suppose there's two parties of the left and one party of the right. Then the two parties of the left would always lose the elections because their vote, they would never get past 50%. They would always, each of the two parties of the left would get, 25%, or one would get 20 and the other would get 30%. But the party of the right that's united in a single party would always get 50% or 51 or 52, whatever. So that creates a very strong incentive for the parties of the left to unite into a single party so that they can get all the votes of all the voters with left-wing preferences into a single party's votes that would get that candidate in that district above 50%. And that incentive to unite into a single party of the left is very strong if the party wants to win elections. But it only applies in a majoritarian single-member district system where each legislative district has only one legislator that wins the election, and those elections are decided by a 50% rule, whichever one gets more than 50 or more percentage than the other candidate. But in Europe, where they've got multi-member districts and different ways of counting votes, so even the candidate who comes in second in that district has a chance of getting into the legislature, you don't get such intense pressure to unite into a single party of the left or a single party of the right, and you get multiple parties of the left and multiple parties of the right in those kinds of electoral systems. But then they face the same problem in the legislature. Once all the parties of the left get into the legislature, they've got to figure out a way to form a coalition by submerging differences and compromising and homogeneizing their preferences to reduce the preference heterogeneity. So that's really what drives it. And I just wanted to mention that because it's an example of a situation where electoral democracy not only has benefits, such as reflecting at least some of the people's preferences some of the time, but it also has costs and there's trade-offs. So I'll stop there and pass to someone else.
No, thanks, Bill. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah. You're saying this is true in Europe. In the United States, it's different, right?
Well, in the United States, each legislative district for the federal legislature only has one member, like only one sitting legislator from that district in the legislature. And the rules for counting the votes are that whoever gets the most votes wins that seat. So in the United States, that's why we have this strong incentive to unite into one party to the left and one party to the right. Yeah.
Right. And just before I go on to the next person, why do you think it is that way in the United States? Do you have any thoughts about that? Is it just historical, or is there some advantage to the system, or any thoughts about that? Or
I'm not an expert in this area, but my guess is that the political scientists who study the origins of the choice of a voting system, in the case of the United States, would probably attribute it to the way elections worked in England in the 1700s when the U.S. Constitution was formed. I think England has, someone here who knows more than me, correct me, but I think England has the same system: majoritarian voting and first past the post rule for counting the votes, and single member districts. Right. Tim is nodding, so yeah, okay.
All right, yeah, good. Well, thanks. Let's see, Joan P.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I believe this is the problem of reducing, like the shrinking number of parties. It's not a problem of representation. There are many more representation forms of democracy, but it is more of electoralism. And electoralism is something that was not created by democracy, and it is something that was not even created by republics. It was created by monarchs who were lazy and did not want to select their own ministers and their own people for doing some tasks. And instead of that, they decided to handle that to some other nobles. And as republics took these, and they kept increasing the pool of people that were basically electing these representatives, they had to grow the vote into concepts and not people, because the pool of people that were being up for being elected was not known to those, and therefore being able to group concepts into parties and made it easier to herd the population into voting for some representative.
Yeah, actually, I had difficulty hearing you. Is it just anybody else have that problem, or?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe something is up with your mic or something, or it sounds like there's a lot of an echo.
Maybe I have to adjust the volume. Is it better now?
I think so, a little bit better.
Okay, yeah. I was just mentioning that I don't believe it's a problem of representation in democracy, but a problem of electoralism. And now electoralism was historically not an invention of republics or democracy, but an invention of monarchy, who had to select ministers and were too lazy, and they decided to handle responsibility to all the nobles, the clergy, and aristocrats. And as republics adopt that same system, they inherited from monarchies. They had to, and they also expanded the pool of people that were voting. And for them, they had to condensate ideas into these things that they call parties. And this was basically because in the previous system, the monarchy won. The people who were being voted for were known by everyone. So it was possible to vote for people and not for parties. But there are other methods that are not electoral representative democracies that do not require the existence of parties. So I just wanted to ask, like, how important is it to have parties? Do we really need them?
Yeah, thank you. I still had problems hearing you, but hopefully somebody else heard you better than I did. Jamal, I think you're next. You have your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
All right. Yeah, I want to circle back a little bit to one of the comments. You're talking about how they're saying people too many choices, like people can't handle too many choices and things like that. And I find that tends to come people who hold some kind of power tend to say, oh, they wouldn't understand, so let's do this for them on their behalf. Oh, they wouldn't get it. Like it's never, it's a very infantile, yeah, it treats people like infantile parentalism kind of behavior of not
Yeah.
even giving people the opportunity or dignity to make their own choice onto themselves. So whenever people say that, my suspicious rate just already goes up immediately. I'm like, what do you mean? Like who are you talking about? Who can make decisions? Like who is that? Because I find part of the thing, the issue is a lack of imagination, because it presupposes that any change that we do is just going to be like a common fix onto the whole thing, not any bigger change onto itself to get like the representative democracy of saying how, oh, how can I have everyone represent? It is how you quoted the study of how government only does 10% of like the wealthiest reflects capital itself, and how like that evidence is there of like the issue itself is capital. Like that, it shows the issue is not people, it's the concentration of wealth. Like, and I think, yeah, but I know we're going to talk about more later in the series of what to do. But I thought it's important to highlight people who's saying those sayings of they wouldn't understand. We have to make these simple, and yeah, and what's the point of what they're trying? Like, what exactly, what power do they gain from saying this?
Right.
I think I fixed my microphone. Can you verify it?
Oh, yep, you're perfect. Better now.
Sorry for that. I totally agree with Jamal.
Okay. All right. I was looking at the chat. Let's see. Somebody, JP, right? I can think of 2 examples for democracy through random selection of a portion of the population was tried successfully in ancient Greece. Okay. Yeah, we're going to get to the random selection as an alternative to elections toward the very end of this write-up, because it would be quite a huge change from the way we do things now. And there are lots of people who say, well, you know, raise their eyebrows about it. That's a pretty serious change that we need to prepare people for. And such a serious revision of how we do democracy would have to be motivated by a widespread consensus that things are not working now and they're not getting any better, and they're getting worse. And to prepare people for that, we need to that's why we're spending so much time talking about the problems with the system, in order to make it such a radical solution seem plausible. Whether it will work or not is another question, which we'll talk about in the future. But there are serious people thinking about this and trying to figure out how it could work, and we'll be getting to that eventually. Tim, welcome for being here. But are you able to talk? You want to talk about Canada, or because I noticed your comment was there. Let's see. Are you there, Tim? Okay. Well, Tim in the chat says that he's referring to, people say it tends to be people. It seems to be the issue in the US, but not in other countries. Canada, for example, has 2 large parties and several smaller parties that can actually hold the balance of power. Yeah. I don't, does actually someone here, if Tim could explain, like, does Canada have a first past the post system, a majoritarian system, or do they have something else? They could, I'm not sure what's going on specifically in Canada. But the larger point here is, before we get bogged down, is that even if there were 3 or 4 parties out there, it would still be an issue, because there's more than 3 or 4 ways of looking at what to do with, you know, what laws, different ways of different views of governance. There's more than 3 or 4 ways. There's a multitude of ways. And yes, there has to be a reduction in order to, at any one time, you have to have a way that is the law of the land, policies that are going to lay down the law, the rules that are going to govern this community for a time at least. So it does have to in the end be reduced to one way of looking at things, but the way it gets reduced is often it seems to be apparently it's dysfunctional. But to make this point really hit home, there is in the write-up, or I'll be talking more about this in the next time, but there was a very recent book called Deaths of Despair, written by Anne Case and Angus Deaton, who are economists, political economists at Princeton, and who Angus Deaton is a Nobel laureate. And the book, there's a review, an interview with them you could find in the write-up if you look carefully down at the end of in the references section. And they're talking specifically about the United States. And their conclusion is pretty, it's empirically documented. They're not suggesting policy, they're just saying this is how it is. 66% of the American public is the American governmental system is not working for them. How do they know that? They know that because 66% of the population of the American population that they're talking about are people with no four-year college degree. That's how many Americans don't have a college degree, 66%. They are experiencing an unprecedented high rate of deaths of despair, but by which they define as suicide, drug addiction, alcoholism, and it's never. And who is this population? They're talking about white people for the most part. Interestingly enough, it's not applying to Hispanics and Blacks, but to white people with no college education. And this has been going on now for several decades, but it's getting worse. And what is the cause of this? Well, they pinpoint generational downward mobility. It's one thing, if people can handle poverty and hard times so long as they believe that things might get better later in their life, or at least for their children, or at least that they see an upward trend. It might be a very small incremental improvement. But when they don't see that, when they see the reverse, they see that they are poorer than their parents were, and they can only anticipate that their children will be poorer than they are. And this is the case with 66% of the American population. So you begin to see how this is the roots of where Trump and Trumpism came from. When people get that despairing, they start looking for, there's a psychological syndrome called Pirate Jenny syndrome, which goes back to Bertolt Brecht's play, The Three Penny Opera, back in the early 20th century, about a cleaning woman in a hotel where she's been abused and treated like scum, and she fantasizes leading a bunch of bandit pirates who to come and kill everybody in the community that she lives. It's a desperate fantasy, and it's like this tear this whole thing down. So I mean, there's part of the motivation for why someone would vote for someone like Donald Trump isn't necessarily because they expect him to solve anything. It's because they see him as an outsider, someone who could trash the system because the system deserves being trashed. And it's not about making things better, it's about lashing out. And the thing is, when Trump is gone, this trend is still there and it's getting worse. So the future may hold something worse than Trump. And this is what is motivating some of this discontent out there. And how did that happen? How did it happen that 66% of the population is in such a state? We're talking about people without college educations. Those people who do have college educations, by the way, are doing reasonably well. That's probably most of the people here in this group. Interestingly enough, even minorities, Blacks and Hispanics, well, they have their own problems. They're actually experiencing at least a slight incremental improvement from generation to generation in terms of the socioeconomic position. So they are at least not yet included in the group. But the thing is, in a democracy, 66% of the population is a very large proportion of it. And that does not bode well for the future of the country. And they're quite, disturbed by this. And anyway, there's a good interview with them in which you can have, where they're asked to explain a lot of things, and I highly recommend that. That's just a moment. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any thoughts or about this, or anything else that I've talked about before, or reactions to it? Go ahead. I think I saw Joan in the bell.
Yes. How would this be related to democracy? I feel like it's more related to alienation from our workplace and people not getting friends because we don't have a social life anymore because we spend our life working for a company.
Mm-hmm.
And we have less democracy at our work, not at our government.
I'm sorry, what you said, how is what related to democracy? What I was just talking about, you mean?
Yeah, like, is this related to democracy at work? And
yeah, it's related. It's related to explaining the dysfunction of democracy, at least in the United States. And by the way, I think that it may not be as severe in other countries which have better education systems, but it definitely is a problem in the United States. Why? Because when people are that, or when a large proportion of the population is suicidal, they're not particularly interested in the functioning anymore. They see the system as completely irrelevant to them. And so anyone who comes along who looks like they're going to blow up the system is very attractive. It's an act of despair, a collective, large act of despair. And they don't see this getting any better. It's only getting worse. And part of it is socioeconomic. It's partly, there was a time back in the 50s and 60s, I'm talking about the Pace and Eaton article or book I was just talking about, when you didn't need a college education to have a middle class life. The unions were strong. You could work at a factory and still make enough money to have a fairly decent middle class life. Well, those days are gone. Unless you are a specialized person, specialized education, that kind of opportunity is no longer available to people without an education. And they see this reflected in their status from one generation to the next, and they see it is getting worse. It shows up in lack of interest in getting married, starting families, because they just don't see a future. And alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, and all kinds of other kinds of abuse become symptomatic of this. And then you get people like like Trump or anyone who's going to overthrow the system, or you get January 6th events. Anyway, it's destructive. It's destructive of democracy as we know it, and the thing is, it's not getting any better. It's getting worse, according to them. And they're not the only ones who are saying this either. But anyway, Bill, go ahead. Bill and then Jamal.
Thanks. I agree with everything you said about how the economy is not working for the bottom 60 percentiles of the population. And many economists on both the left and the right are looking really closely at the causes of this problem. The most stark statistic I've ever heard about the problem is that the real wages and salaries of the bottom 60 percentiles of the population have been completely stagnant since 1980, meaning 0% growth in wages and salaries for them since 1980. which means that all of the growth in the size of the national economic pie since 1980 has gone to the top 40 percentiles, and none of that growth or increase in the size of the pie has gone to the bottom 60 percentiles. None. Like, they're not getting any of the benefits of that economic growth for now 42 years. So that's my first comment. And my second comment goes back to the previous thing you said about how somehow a lot of preferences of a lot of voters are being ignored when things get boiled down to two parties and then eventually boiled down to a single law. I simply wanted to point out what political economists have shown technically through modeling and mathematical proofs, which is that the costs of reaching consensus increase as the heterogeneity of preferences in the group increases. So if the preferences of all members of the group are completely homogeneous and they want, every member of the group wants the exact same thing, then the costs of reaching consensus are very low. But as the preferences of group members become more heterogeneous and different people want different things, the costs of reaching consensus rise, and eventually those costs rise so high that they're not worth bearing for even the members of the group. The members of the group will find that it's not worth it to them to bear the costs of reaching consensus, and they'll either leave the group or they'll figure out some way to reduce heterogeneity, either through a switch to authoritarianism or a switch to states' rights, where people self-select into California or Arizona or Montana based on having the same preferences as people who live there, et cetera, et cetera. The point is simply that there's a fundamental constraint on representing preferences through consensus building institutions like democracy. And the fundamental constraint is the costs of reaching consensus increase with the heterogeneity of the preferences of members in the group. And there's kind of no easy way around that. All of the solutions that I mentioned and other solutions to that problem to reduce the costs of consensus down to the point where they're worth bearing and consensus can be reached, all of those alternative solutions are second best solutions, each in the sense that each of those alternative solutions has problems of its own. So that's the constraints. And I just wanted to put that out on the table so that when folks recommend solutions like sortition, random selection of legislators, the question is, how does that alternative meet the constraints, and what are the negatives of that alternative? Okay, I'll pass. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, we're going to get to that, and there are answers to those questions according to the people who advocate this. But I did want to comment on what you said too just now about the cost of dealing with creating consensus becomes too steep to tolerate, and the strong suspicion that from the people I've read is that yeah, that's exactly true, and that's why we don't, well, to use Martin Gillen's phrase, we don't currently in the United States anyway have a democracy. It's a democracy in name only, to quote his exact phrase. What we have, in effect, we don't call it that, we have an epistocracy, an oligarchy. However, so the advantages on oligarchy is that you can create a two-tier system where you have those people who know what they're doing, running the show, and everybody else is engaged in some sort of theatrics, and that's what the voting stuff is about. It's about giving people the illusion of choice without actual choice. And there's a kind of stability there. If you can keep people engaged, so they're busy thinking they're having an effect on government without actually having most people having any kind of genuine say in government, while the technocrats, the elite, the experts, the epistocrats, the people who are knowledgeable, they're running the show because they know better than the rest of us, and they know better than the rest of us, and they have access to power. And so that's what we actually have in practice. We have an oligarchy. An epistocracy is a type of oligarchy in which the knowledgeable rule, the people who are in a position to know what is good for the country. But in order for that to work in our system with our background beliefs in the the dignity of individuals having a voice in government. In order for that to work and not have rebellion, you need to give people some kind of ceremony to believe that they're engaged in it. So you can achieve a kind of stability there where it's really it's the subset of the population that's running the show, and they're fine with this because they have the power, but they can only make it work if they keep most people engaged in some other activity, to keep them occupied until the system breaks down. And this is what some people fear, that when 66% of the population is becoming suicidal, that we're getting pretty close to perhaps violence someday. When people wake up, they may roll, historically heads have rolled over this thing, but I'm not saying that's likely to happen anytime soon, but things may need to get a lot worse than they are now before that happens. But the idea is that we don't actually have a democracy in the United States right now. If by democracy is meant that what most people want their government does, if we mean something else by democracy, that maybe, and it could be, and this is an argument that has been made, that frankly, that's how it should be, because most people don't know what they want. Most people want inconsistent, they're irrational. They don't really, we can't trust the mob to rule things. Plato figured that out a long time ago. He favored an epistocracy, although he had all kinds of checks to make sure it wasn't an abusive one. That's one of the background ideas that is swirling here. The idea that we don't have democracy, we have one in name only, and in reality, we have an oligarchy that's functioning right now. And why don't we just call it that? Well, because we just don't want to give up on the idea of democracy. And maybe we should. Some people argue, well, it's time to give up on the idea. And others say, no, last time when we talked about the arguments for democracy, I gave what I think is a pretty good argument, one that convinces me, that suggests why democracy is valuable in the literal sense in which the governed should and ought to have a say in their government, even when they make bad decisions. In the same way, the analogy was a parent trying to govern in great detail what their relatively older child who's in a position now to make their own decisions, to try it when the parent tries to meddle in things too much. It's important, even when the parent is right, even when the parent knows that this decision this young person's making is a bad one, there's developmental, and there's a value in having people learn these things by themselves rather than having a paternalistic authority run the show for them. There's something to be gained in the experience of making bad decisions is an important experience in a person's individual development, but it's also true at the collective level of an entire nation. And so that even when democracies make bad decisions, it's good that they're democracies. That's the theory anyway. It depends. Anyway, thanks, Bill. And you can come back and say more later. I appreciate your comments. Jamal? Yeah,
I'm still here. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Cool. When come back on the 66%, at least highlight an aspect of how people tend to put an emphasis on the 60% of being uneducated per se. And like that's an issue, like the education or lack of education. But I think that ignores all the historical materialistic things that happened that led them to that point, which I think Bill did a good job of highlighting, of the economic policies and such that were set in play that led to their jobs being like the wage being stagnant, as in the wage was stolen from them, given to the people like us, the educated class, the financial tech class, took the wealth from the bottom 60%. And I think like it's acknowledging that gives them the 60% more autonomy and power and respect than people have realized because like you said, most of us are college educated, how we tend to dismiss or talk about them sometimes like, oh, they don't have a good education and things like that. And we tend to at times treat their opinions or needs and wants as not as important based on that, which I think is important to keep in mind and check. Like that bias of just because you don't have an education does not mean you do not know what you're talking about or what you want for yourself.
Mhm.
And another thing is the issue of consensus and resources. I think it is a false one in the sense that a big part that people miss is the material scarcity. Like we can, like everyone knows America is the richest and like most material wealth and like country in the world. We have like a lot of resources to do things in the world, and the a lot of resources. The will is lacking, but we have the resources to do many things at once. And I think a lot of the times people are put in this idea like you can't do multiple things at once. Like consensus, oh, we can't do all those things. Like yes, like sometimes there is no real material reasons why, other than just lack of will for why multiple things cannot be done at the same time, which I think can help alleviate the cost, highlighting the true cost or seeing the cost of reaching consensus is not as high if you remove a false sense of scarcity, if it's not actually the resources that are not actually accurate reflected in the decision. But yeah, just thought put those thoughts and comments in the discussion.
Okay. Before I move on to another point, Joan, your hand is still up. Do you want to say something more?
Yes, I wanted to add to the heterogeneity of parties and the multiple parties that Bill commented on, and is that I want to emphasize on parties having two purposes, right? One of them is to get votes, and the other one is getting money to get votes through electoral campaigns, right? So the first thing they will do is they will try to cater to the people who will fund them, right? We will have things like Microsoft funding a Biden campaign, and Biden 2 weeks later giving a huge fund to Microsoft on Google's for the army, like 2 billion. It was crazy, things like that. So politicians will never try to cater to the people they are appealing to. They will only try to cater to the people who they are getting funded by. And the second one is the fake illusion of heterogeneity in modern politics. And is that they need to gather votes. And a simple way of doing that is not telling them that they are the best party, is telling them that the other one is the worst one. So they will try to create the fake illusion of we are different, very different from the other one, because that's the way they have for the electoral masses to distance themselves from the other one while still keeping the same policies and acting in similar ways. I frankly think the American politics are just a show that's put there for the people to not revolt. And sadly, that comes to a sad conclusion, is that our best practices for democracy in most of the Western world have not come through the ballot, but from violence. Women's rights were won by placing bombs at houses of congressmen. Similar thing for the decolonization of, or partial decolonization of Puerto Rico. Several people were involved shooting people in power. The black vote was not obtained through the ballot, that's for sure. The 40-hour week included bombings in several cities in the north of the US. The slave freedom included an entire civil war, and the list keeps going on. Yeah. So discarding violence, I mean, it is not very correct to talk like this, but is it really necessary to discard every form of violence, even the pacifist one that would maybe involve not damaging any person, but instead damaging the correct functioning of the status quo? Like, for example, Rosa Parks sitting on a white-only seat.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joan. Actually, you mentioned something that's going to sort of a segue into another part, and that's of this. and that's capture. There's another reason why representation isn't happening, and this is perhaps more well known, and it's been talked about a lot. And Martin Gillen's presentation, which you can find a link to, is on YouTube, is an excellent one. And he wrote a book called Affluence and Influence, or something like that, years ago, which was the thing. What capture is that, as you pointed out, Joe, well, here's another little tidbit. In the United States Congress, there are 430 legislators if you combine the senators and the House of Representatives. For every single one of those these government lawmakers, there are 4 lobbyists for every single one of them. So that's 4 times 430, about 1,300 lobbyists from one industry alone, whose job it is to influence policy. And that one industry is the healthcare industry. So if you wonder why healthcare in the United States is so bad, why nothing ever changes, it's because there's 4 for every single person in the House of in government who's making laws. There's 4 full-time, well-heeled people from the healthcare industry hovering over each of these lawmakers. And these people have money, and they're there all the time. And there's not going to be any serious healthcare reform as long as that's going to alter the current system in the United States, because they're there with this vast resources. That's capture. If a congressperson wants to win an election, they have to, of course, cater to it costs a tremendous amount of money to win elections. They have to get the money from somewhere. Who has the money? It's these industries. And if they don't pay attention to them, even if you have a well-meaning, perfectly idealistic congressperson who really wants to do the right thing, they can't get elected, and they won't stay elected unless they listen to these people who are funding them, their campaigns. It's not the average person. So they're in the pockets of these very large, powerful, wealthy concentrations of power, which there are several these days, but that's just one, and that's just one example, one industry. Multiply it by, then you have the energy industry, there's just an unbelievable amount of money that is being thrown around in government in the United States to make sure that whatever government does, it does not conflict with the interest of these powerful groups. And how on earth is that ever going to change? Well, you can't, as I said, you can't get elected, and you can't stay elected unless you pay attention to them. So that's part of the problem here, is that it stands in the way of reform. How is reform ever going to happen when the people in positions of power who control the possibility of reform cannot move an inch against the system that keeps them in place? And that, of course, means they're not representing the general public, they're representing these powerful special interests. Anyway, but thanks, Joe. Tim, you got your hand up? Are you there, Tim? Hi, Tim. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. That's not.
Tim, you're muted. Unmute
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, you're muted.
Now you're
You hear?
unmuted. But we still can't hear you.
Hello, Tim? Yeah. Where are you, Tim? Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, Tim, if you can hear us, if you can, if you fix your problem, just raise your hand again, and let me know. Let's see, Mike. Go ahead, Mike. You there?
Yeah, I am actually. I am. Hang on a second. One moment, please. I've got kind of a awkward setup here, and I froze on one of them. Froze, but anyway, it could change, Victor. I think if a figure like Bernie caught on sufficiently in the United States.
Yeah.
That's
And what do you what would have to happen for Bernie to catch on? It seems to me he would have to get money from a lot of people to, you know, frankly, I'm quite surprised he even exists. He's even on office, let alone.
Personally, I think he's a little too far left for me, but you know, it could still work. I don't know. He's gotten a long way. So
Yeah, but he's one person in a you know, he's far away from. He's not going to win. He's not going to change the law in Washington single-handedly. So, I mean, yeah, he's a symbol of something.
There's a pretty substantial contingent on the far left. There's Pramila, name, and AOC, and
Right.
So, you know, it's not inconceivable that they could buck the system and make some changes. Yeah,
but the thing that here's probably what would, I mean, I'm speculating here, but if whatever political views became dominant, I mean, if by some chance people like Bernie and AOC and others got in position, I mean, if a number of people like that threaten the existing system, they would be either seriously, I don't think they're considered a serious threat by the powers that be right now, because they're just too small. But if they did become a serious threat, then they would be threatened with capture. They would say, okay, you can continue to stay in office, but here you have to take some money. I mean, you're going to need money to do it. We have the money. So I don't see that money disappearing from the scene anytime soon under the current system. Anyway, thanks, Mike. See, I think is it Joan or Jamal?
Joan. Yeah.
Joan.
I would really calling Bernie Sanders far left. I mean, I'm from Europe, and he would be center. He's a social democrat, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, we are constantly, I mean, this is about representative democracy, but we are only considering electoral representative democracy. Do we consider other ones? Like you already mentioned the selection by random portions of the population, which was tried in ancient Greece with some catches. And it was also tried recently in France with the Yellow Vest protest, with really successful results. Everyone was agreeing to almost everything there, but it failed on its application because it contradicted the will of the dominant class of France. And I can also think on Soviet democracy, which is a more direct form of representation that does not involve that many elections, where you would basically gather together with people like-minded, form a structure. In this case, it was called the Soviet, and keep going like that. You select a representative of your group. It was called Soviet. It's a word that may spare some fear here in the US, but it's basically some kind of form. And there is also similar things. Well, I mean, not similar to this thing, but more direct forms with mixed electoral and direct forms of representation, like Switzerland has, where if a small percentage of the population wants something to happen, I'm talking a very small one, like 5%, they collect signatures, they send it to Parliament, and Parliament does not debate it. They don't have the power to reject it. It goes into a referendum, and the referendum has the power of passing that law or rejecting any law that the Parliament does. Which is, again, a more direct form of democracy that can't coexist with electoral. So are we going to cover any of these non-electoral or partial electoral representative forms of democracy? I mean, maybe now or in the future?
No, definitely. Yeah, thanks very much, Joan. Yeah, we are moving toward, see, it's the idea of non-electoral representative democracy is, at least in the United States, almost unheard of as far as I know of in this country. Yeah, you're right. It's been tried, at least that I'm aware of, on small scales in different parts of the world. And I've heard of something similar in British Columbia and Ireland. And thanks for your input about Europe. I really appreciate your comments, because you know that part of the world better than we do. And yes, toward the end, we're moving toward taking there are philosophers. There's a I don't really want to get into it just now because it changes the focus of the discussion, but we are moving toward a consideration of alternatives to electoral representative. We're still going to have democracy, still going to have representation of some sort, because direct democracy has its own set of problems, even though maybe it's technologically feasible, but there are other reasons why it might not be desirable. But there are other ways to do representative democracy other than elections, and those haven't really been discussed, or even under a little. They haven't been discussed. They haven't even been known as possibilities, as far as I know, in places like the United States, at least not until very recently. So we're moving in that direction. But because it's such a radical idea compared to what we're used to in the United States, what we're doing now is preparing the way, because before you consider such a radical alternative way of doing government, you have to be pushed there. You have to say, look, what we've tried and what we're doing now and what we have tried in the past isn't working. So we need to try something new, something different. So that's why I'm spending so much time talking about the problems with the existing system in preparation for opening up the possibility of a different way of doing this. Anyway, thank you.
Well, while the US has not tried these examples of other forms of democracies, they have been tried in the past and they've been successful in other countries.
Right.
And will we also talk about Soviet democracy, for example, for organizing groups?
Okay. Yeah, well, I hope you stick around for when we get to that, because I would really appreciate your insight when we get to alternatives.
Yeah, another thing about the technology, I remember I was I'm in the technological field, and I decided to work in one open source program that's been applied in, I do not remember the Latin American country that it was, but it was basically that there is already technology being developed to organize society more horizontally and have direct democracy, both on workplace, cooperatives, and forms of government.
Yeah. Well, I did talk a little bit about direct democracy last time, and both the problems with it and the theory of it. And we might, if toward the end, when we give up talking about the problems with the existing system here, the dominant system here in the United States and many Western countries, when we start looking at alternatives, we may return to direct democracy and see if there's a way in which that could work in what the experience is where it has been tried. But anyway, Brenda has her hand up. Go ahead, Brenda.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about our terms, because we keep on using the term democracy. And I mean, if you look at our history, the Constitution itself set up how our government was structured, and the fact that it's going to be a republic, how we're going to vote for our members of Congress. The Bill of Rights came because the colonies were not happy with just the Constitution. They wanted a guarantee of their individual rights. So the Bill of Rights names that, the rights that each individual has. But nowhere were we a democracy. I mean, women couldn't vote. We had slavery. In fact, when the country first started, in order to vote, you had to own property. That's something we inherited from England, which we soon corrected. So there's no way we were a democracy. So democracy, this idea of a democracy kind of came later as we started trying to equalize, equalize rights and equalize the field. But to talk about us as a democracy, it might be where we're leaning now, but according to the Constitution, because that's really our guide, it doesn't have to be how we are. That's kind of optional. So yeah, so I think that kind of needs some clarification. I'm kind of like uncomfortable with always referring to us as a democracy when we're really sure we have a leaning toward it in our spirit, in the way we look at human rights, but it's not really how we're set up.
Thanks, Brenda.
I think the correct word would be representative government republic. I think that's the one that's used in the Constitution. And several of the founding fathers mentioned that the US should never be a democracy because that leads to anarchy.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda, and Joan, to the, we don't, strictly speaking, a democracy means the governed, the people who have to live under the laws, make the laws. And that means everybody in society who has to live under the laws has to have a voice in those laws. Well, that situation, as far as I know, has perhaps never existed, on a large scale anywhere, except on a small scale. Here's an example of where real democracy, like as in that purest form, does exist. It exists in small groups. Think of the Supreme Court, 9 people, or in the United States, juries with 12 or 13 people. When they make a decision, every single one of them is equal to every other one, and that decision is made. Their voice is matters. But the problem with democracy is it doesn't scale well to very large numbers of people. This is where representation seems to become a necessity of some kind, unless you can make direct democracy workable at a large scale involving millions of people. And that has been considered impractical in the past because for historical reasons. There's some suggestion today that nowadays that technologically it's possible, but there are other reasons why direct democracy, but we'll get into that later. But getting back to your point, Brenda, about which leads, yeah, of course, you're right. This isn't, strictly speaking, a democracy, or for that matter, I'm not sure of any major country that is, in that strict sense, a democracy. But you're right. We use the word to call something democratic is to praise it. It's not to abuse it, or when I say something's democratic, that usually is a term of praise. But from certain, like Plato saw it as mob rule. Because if you don't have a high regard for the average person's opinion about the world, then the average person's opinion about the world is not a good opinion that should prevail. So you have to have a lot of faith in people to believe in democracy, that your average person really knows what they want and they are wise enough to make good decisions. And not everyone believes that. There's lots of philosophers who's beginning with Plato, who thought that you can't take people on the street, just anyone, and have them make responsible decisions about, it's just not going to work. You need people who are educated, who know about the alternatives, who are just, and you have to combine these virtues, the ethical virtues, with the epistemic virtues of knowing what works and what doesn't. And those virtues are not going to be found in just the average person on the street. And those are the people who should be running the show. But that's not called a democracy. That's called an epistocracy. That's ruled by the knowledgeable. But who decides who's a knowledgeable person and who isn't? And that's where it gets ugly and messy. But I'm going to come back to something you suggested, Brenda, about in a moment when I talk about. Let me just skip that for now. You see, there's 3 people with their hands up: Mike, Jamal, Joan, and Joan. I forgot who has their hand up first. Does anybody remember?
Not yet.
Who?
Jamal. This is Jamal.
Jamal.
I'll go.
All right, go ahead, Jamal.
Yeah, I want to talk about at least piggyback your point of like the lobbyists of how like the healthcare industry, like how there's many lobbies per each congressman. And I think Mike brought up a good example of like the so-called like the squad, the left and Democratic AOC and them, and the guy elected for being like quote unquote left-wing progressives. But it was an example of how as soon as the guy into power, they became more or less like the status quo, like how they changed due to the power and the position itself, which I think is a good example of it doesn't matter the individual itself who gets into the position of power, it's the system itself that needs to be addressed. Like putting this person, oh, this person, I like this person to go into this position does not, will not change or does not change in the direction they promised they're going to change due to the nature of how the power that they wield and the nature of it itself, which I think is just a good point to highlight as an example. They mean well, but due to the system itself, they're forced to bend and acquiesce to the change they're going to fight. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jamal. Yeah, even if you have to go into politics with the best possible intentions and you succeed in getting yourself into the door, you're not going to stay there unless you bow down to the powers that be, the people with the money, or you're not going to be reelected. It's that simple. This is what capture means. That's why it's like there's no way out of it. Not without radically altering the system, and what is the motivation for radically altering the system? Well, the only people who can radically alter it are people in power, and the people in power are in power precisely because of the system. This is the bind we're in. Anyway, Mike and then Joe. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, it's about the kind of hair splitting type definitions. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold myself. Democracy and Republican. I kind of have gotten out of the habit of using either one of those terms. I just use the 3-word phrase rule by majority. So if the government seems to be if we seem to exhibit some kind of rule by the majority of the population, that kind of counts as democracy to me. And I think the problems really start when the majority is not ruling that through their votes, or there is no such direct democracy anywhere in the world at a government level. But the real problems we have right now, I think, are the electoral college, where the loser is the president half the time, and out of control gerrymandering, where some states in I think it's Wisconsin, the Republicans get 50% of the vote, but they hold a near super-majority of the seats. So in those cases, it gets close to rule by minority. So if you want, the simplest way there is, I think, that for me to look at this is that it's either ruled by majority or it is, and then in that case it counts as a democracy. If it's not, then if it's ruled by a minority, then it's not a democracy. Anyway, that's my simple way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, if it's less than a majority, then you're right. You can't have democracy and have a rule by minority. Then it would be, there's another name for that. It's called an oligarchy, where it's a smaller subset of the population that runs things. And there are different kinds of oligarchies, but
an oligarchy is a minority, right?
Yeah,
just to be clear,
yeah. It could be historically, they can be like aristocracies by certain blood lines that are especially endowed to be the rulers, or it could be the economic elite, the educational elite. It's any group that's powerful enough, that isn't everybody, but powerful enough to hold its own and control the reins of power.
It seems like we've got a situation where we're being ruled by a minority in the Supreme Court, and they're not supposed to rule anyway. I don't know. There's a great video by Ben Sass, the senator, that I posted that kind of explains.
Yeah, I saw the video. You posted it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. That was a nice little speech he gave there, but who knows what
He's a
I'm
great,
gonna-
great speaker and a sane Republican too. Although coincidentally and ironically, today is his last day. He resigned. He's
Oh, really?
resigned his position, and
Yeah.
he's taking over as president of some university.
He resigned from office?
Effective today.
Really? Well, see, that's an interesting thing. If you're halfway
He
serious.
described the problem. He said, "Look, this is the problem. Goodbye."
Yes, I know. See, that's the thing. Once a senator or a representative says, "I've had enough. This is enough BS," they have to leave office because he won't be reelected. He told people the truth. They don't want to hear it. I mean, it's like that's what happens if you have any integrity and you're a politician. It's very hard to combine those two things. And it's not necessarily that your politicians are necessarily corrupt. They can't be where they're at without money, and the money's got to come from somewhere. The system requires that. Anyway, but we've said that several times. I want to switch a little bit on the topic a little bit, and then we could open it up again. I want to talk about a problem, another problem with representation. Okay, we've already discussed how there isn't really a democracy here, or perhaps nowhere in the world. I mean, a pure one. Well, is there a representative democracy anywhere here or in the world? And what would one look like if there were? A number of years ago, I ran across a book by a French philosopher named Sylviane Agacinski. She teaches at the École Normale in Paris, the elite institution there in France. It was called Sexual Parity, I believe, or at least the English translation of it was, in which she suggested that, and at the time she was married to Lionel Jospin, the socialist prime minister of France at the time, so she was a professor of political philosophy there, but she was in a peculiar position to be both a theoretician about philosophy and actually have a say in tweaking power because her husband was prime minister. And she suggested in her book that among the many, if you want to have something that's closer to representative democracy, we need to have representatives actually represent things that have some genuine differences between people versus fluid or artificial or temporary differences between people. And she's a difference feminist in the sense that as in contrast to say an equality feminist who tend to downplay the differences between men and women. A difference feminist says no, men and women are not interchangeable. They represent different perspectives on the world, and if you want to have a truly just representative government, you need to have a government in which women are at least half the time in positions of power, all positions of power. And this is not going to happen if you leave it to the whim of the electorate. It needs to be written into the law, into the Constitution. So to translate her ideas into, say, to make it graspable for an American audience, imagine we had a law, a constitutional amendment that required that 50 of the US senators be female, and that every other election in the House of Representatives or the presidency, only women can run for those offices to make sure that half the time we have a female president and so that the positions of power in the would always be divided very close to 50-50. And why would that be a good idea? Because so immediately people will say, well, wait a minute, there's a lot of other differences besides sex and gender that aren't being represented in government. But her argument was this, that there is no other difference between people that is as durable and as deep-seated as sex and biological sex. And for example, in the United States, only 20% of the people in the legislature are women. It's gotten better than it used to be, but But the thing is, 80% of the US Congress isn't now, nor will it ever be, in a position of being pregnant. And without that possibility, how are they supposed to pass laws that do affect people who do have that possibility of being pregnant? For example, the thought here is, of course, on abortion policy. Her view is that things like the big objections are that there are many other differences that would also have to be taken into account if we took her quota system seriously. You'd have to. What about minority groups, language groups, religions? Do we have to have to have true representation? Do we have to have if 50% of the population is Protestant? Does that mean we have to have 50% Protestant legislators? And her argument is, or socioeconomic classes, is that all these other differences between people are highly variable. They change from one generation to another. Geography, for example, this is the most blatant example, is in the United States, if you live in Florida, you cannot legally represent the state of Washington. Why? There used to be a historical reason for that, because you don't have an epistemic intimacy with the people you're representing. Epistemic intimacy means you know something about the situation in which they're living in. And if you're living in one state and representing another, you can't really do that. At least that was the idea. Now, of course, nowadays, using the technology we're using right now, that's not necessarily true. I could live in Mexico, where I happen to be right now, as a matter of fact, and talk to people in the United States and be aware of what's going on there and everything. So it's no longer technologically impossible for someone to be living in one place, but representing a different kind of people in a very different part of the world. But there are laws right now in the United States. It's still the law. You cannot be living in Florida and representing Washington State. You can visit Florida, but you can't live there. So why does geography, your street address, have more needs to be represented in government, but your gender, your sex doesn't? And that's her point, that sex is a very real divider of perspective on the world. And it doesn't mean that men can't and women can't share the same values, but that's not the point here. It isn't about what values you can share. It's about your position in the world. And biological sex is a major marker of how you experience the world, that distinguishes you from someone else of a different sex or gender, that is more durable, that's less likely. I know there are transsexuals and trans, that's a possibility, but of all the other things that divide people, socioeconomics, religion, language, culture, all those things change, even in the course of one lifetime, let alone from one generation to another. But sex rarely changes. So her view is that government power needs to be divided as a matter of constitutional law equally between men and women. And she actually, I believe, sort of succeeded in at least getting her view out there in France. Now, I don't know that France did accept her views. She's just a political philosopher, and no one really listens to political philosophers, but it did start a discussion. So anyway, this is just okay. Jamal, you have your hand up. Go ahead. Do you want
yeah, I think this is a good example of not addressing the root cause itself of what the issue. It's there's a popular meme, popular scene seeing around that I think representing well is there's a meme of a cartoon of a UAV drone in the Middle East, like bombing them in like 2008. And then this was in 2024. It now has like the pride flag, the island picture on. Like, it's still fundamentally, materially, nothing has changed, just like the stickers. So, as in, if you had a female president, it doesn't change the nature itself, which caused the patriarchy or address the fundamental patriarchy issues. Nonetheless, it doesn't address the issue. Like, I find it like very, identitarian. Like, it's important. Don't get it twisted. Like, it's important. Like, minorities, women, and everyone's voices be heard. But what they're saying is not they want to be in places of power. They want their material conditions to change so what their harm that's caused to them doesn't happen. Not more CEOs. Like yeah, I'll say I'm a black male, and I don't want more black CEOs. That's not what we're asking for. Like that's not, you're not fixing the fundamental problem itself. You're just
Mhm.
not even doing the bare minimum yet. You're just missing the issue. You're not listening. But yeah, that's why I think like it's a good point. I see what you're saying. Like, yes, women need more representation in power itself, but the issue is not the representation in power, is how the power is used or the system of power is accumulated. That's what it is, not the, I think that's what, yeah. I think that is a more useful, productive conversation and focus rather than is this person X, Y, or Z criteria for this role. But that's what.
Okay, well, I think her point was this, that to the extent that there are differences in people out there in the demos, the governed population, not all differences are equal. Some of them are deep-seated differences, some of them are changeable and mutable. And especially, and it doesn't mean that people with very fundamentally different views can't share the same values. It's just that some of them are very specific to where you are in the world. In geography, that you're in one state isn't one of them. Your street address is not essential to who you are, but your genitalia is a little bit closer to that. And especially when there are issues like, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think with that concept is rather than focusing on the things that make us differences, like focusing on things that make us the same. Like for example, like healthcare, infrastructure, like these are the issues like are not, doesn't matter who you are. These are the fundamental things like everyone needs, like clean air. Like these are, I think that'd be a more, but that's the whole point of it. Like that's the change, like changing the focus from these identitarian politics to like the common things, the material conditions people are living in. And I think that's why geography, I guess for me, I think geography is important because how do you know your community and how can you present your community if you're not from there or actually walk the walk or talk and see exactly what you need? You can't. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think it's important to live in the community that you're going to represent so they actually know what's actually material conditions that are happening in the area you're supposed to represent. Yeah.
Right. Well, this isn't not an argument. This is not an argument against geographical representation. It's only that among the different things that sort people up into different groups, some things are just more fundamental than others. And people move all the time from one state to another, one country to another, but they don't change their sex that often in the course of a lifetime. Even racial differences, those change. There's miscegenation. People become mixed race. That changes. Religion, people change their religion or they drop their religion. Languages, they move to another country to learn another language. All their socioeconomic status, that changes during the course of their life and perhaps from one generation to another. So all those things, while not that they're not important, it's that they aren't quite as fundamental as biological sex is. That's her point. And if we had a more representative society, it would be factored in, or at least it should rank much higher than geography does, is her point. Anyway, so yeah, I'm sorry. I appreciate your point though. Okay, Mike and Bill, I forget which one of you had your hand up first. Do you guys remember who was first? I see Mike first, but
Mike was first.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, one issue regarding geographic location in the United States, and this is a real problem, and you may have mentioned this, but rural votes pack a lot more of a wallop in the big scheme of things than urban votes. So, I mean, and just that's something to think about. So if you live in, for example, Wyoming. So if I move to Wyoming, who I vote for president, I've got like a 10 or 30 times greater say just because of the way the electoral college is designed. So whereas, yeah, I mean, that's my point. I think, I mean, there aren't enough women in politics, but anyway, I'm still
Yeah.
getting balls together.
Yeah, well, there are other reasons. I mean, this whole gender thing was actually another topic we discussed a number of years ago. But there are value differences that are not between any given male or female, but statistically. For example, where large groups of people were asked to rank their most important values, and there was a list of 10 of them. Things like health, freedom, security, and on and on. There was a clear, almost everybody, at least in where these surveys were done, which I think was the United States, freedom and security were at the top of the list for almost everybody. However, there was a difference between whether you were male or female. If you were female, security was number one, freedom number two. If you were male, it was reversed. And that's pretty consistent across many cultures. And that has something to do, and that would have an effect in how you would prioritize your values if you were a politician and could decide public policy, or, for example, how many resources you would put into domestic affairs versus foreign affairs, on healthcare versus, say, economic development, and so on. It doesn't mean that people don't value both, but it does affect the ranking. And if you want representation, then you need to have that, take that into account. Bill, go ahead, and then John. Bill, you there?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So that example you gave from that political philosopher in France was very thought-provoking for me. So the first thought that comes to mind is that just because a legislator or a court judge looks like certain people, is the same gender or the same race, does not mean that he shares the same preference. So the first example that comes to mind is Clarence Thomas, very
Yes.
conservative Supreme Court justice, where if you take a survey of African Americans who are members of the Democratic Party, they would probably say that they do not feel that Clarence Thomas reflects their policy preferences. And the same with a senator from South Carolina, Tim Scott, who is an African American, but he's a member of the Republican Party and he's a conservative. I think if you were to survey African American voters in South Carolina who are members of the Democratic Party, they would probably say that they do not feel Tim Scott represents or reflects their policy preferences. So, and the same with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal Supreme Court justice who was a woman. I think if you were to survey conservative women voters who are members of the Republican Party, they would probably say that they did not feel Ruth Bader Ginsburg represented or reflected their policy preferences. So that's my first thought, is that having a legislator or court justice who looks like certain voters in terms of race or gender does not necessarily mean that he's going to reflect those voters' policy preferences or implement those voters' policy preferences. So that leads to my second point, which is that the French political philosophers' policy proposal to have 50% of the legislative seats be reserved for women, it illustrates a fundamental point, which is that representation is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. Rules of representative democracy, election, etc., they're all a means of trying to make sure that the people who make the laws implement the policy preferences of the population and do not implement policy preferences contrary to the nation's population. To make sure that the laws reflect what the people want and the laws do not reflect what the people don't want. To keep undesired laws from getting passed and to make it that desired laws are getting passed. That's the goal. And so all these rules for representation, including, election laws, et cetera, including the French political philosophers' proposal to have 50% of the legislative seats reserved for women, those are all means to the end goal. And so I think the question then is, does a particular rule, like the French political philosophers' rule or any other rule, how well or not well does it contribute to that ultimate goal of making sure that the laws that get passed are what the people want and not what the people don't want? And a lot of the other issues we've discussed today could be capsulized by that basic question. Like a lot of the problems you mentioned, Victor, are problems where the laws passed by the government do not reflect what the people want. They reflect what the majority of the people don't want. So I'll pass. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I do want to emphasize what Sylviane Agacinski is her name, the French philosopher, political philosopher who argued for this, is it's not about getting that all women agree about politics. They don't, any more than all men agree about politics. It's structural. It's not about if we believe the structure of the representation is at least starting from a place that is at least partly significantly representative of the people, representative, of course you get highly conservative or male-like women, but you will be in the larger scheme of things, you will get policies that are more women friendly if women had more power. Simply, not that this or that representative would always be towing the same line, that any more than in the Black community or any other community that everybody who's Black is going to be automatically a liberal. They're not going to be, or the reverse. Anyone who's white is automatically conservative. But it's about structure. It's if we do take structure as an important criteria in deciding who's going to be a representative. If it didn't make any difference, then why not have, let's say, politicians in Mexico decide the laws in the United States? It doesn't matter. All that matters is that they have the right political values. What difference does the country they live in matter? Why don't we go international? Apparently, this is what I'm getting at is what is sometimes philosophers call epistemic affinity. Because of our location in the world, it does make a difference in not in detail, not in every possible way, but it does. We're looking at the world from a place, a geographic place, a racial, a language, a culture, a gender place. Not all these are equally powerful, and they're certainly not all determining any given decision. They don't necessarily dictate the decision, but they are a structural framework around which many of our decisions will be made. And some structural frameworks are more durable, more solid, more deeply rooted than others. And her point was that sex is literally the paradigm case of this most deeply rooted difference between people. So it isn't that you can't have Black people who are conservative and white people who are liberal, or that all women are going to be on the same side of political issues or not. It's just that if you're going to have some kind of structural framework, this is as good as the most well-justified structure that you can find, because these differences are very fundamental. At least that's their argument.
May I offer a quick rebuttal to what you said?
Sure, go ahead.
So I just performed a thought experiment, thinking about what might happen and what I would predict would happen if 50% of the legislative seats in the United States federal legislature, Congress, were reserved for women. One thing that I think would happen is that a lot of the lobbyists for interest groups that want low taxes would devote a lot of lobbying effort to the women legislators to explain to them all the reasons why tax increases are bad for the economy, bad for economic growth, bad for job creation, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of those women legislators would wind up voting to keep taxes low in response to that lobbying effort. And that's just one example of the ways that women legislators in Congress, if they were 50% of the legislators in the Congress, a lot of them would wind up voting the way men vote for reasons that basically overwhelm their gender-informed preferences or their gender-informed inclinations. In other words, those women legislators would not just decide how to vote on legislation based on their female identity. They would decide based on a lot of other things, and a lot of those other things would cause them to vote the way men would vote. So it's not clear to me that you would get laws that reflect women's interests more in such a legislature than you do now. You might on particular issues where the issue at stake in the proposed legislation is very clearly a woman's issue. But then again, even the way the legislature is now, you get legislation on women's issues. I don't know. I think the conclusion from my thought experiment is that I'm not sure what would happen if you had 50% of the legislative seats reserved for women. I'm not sure you would get the outcome that the French political philosopher thinks you would get, however, because a lot of those women would wind up voting like men due to other factors that have nothing to do with their gender. So, okay, I'll thanks for listening.
I think you're right that it doesn't, that wouldn't change fundamentally change the capture problem. Obviously, it doesn't matter if 50% of the government was female, then that percentage would be lobbied just like the current government. Current representatives are lobbied, and they face all the same pressures. And if they didn't, kowtow to the right people, they wouldn't be elected. There would be, they would find women who share their political views and support them and get them elected instead. So no, it's not about, but see, this is not, fundamentally, that's about politics. And maybe there's something I should have said from the very beginning. Well, the perspective I'm taking on here is a perspective that judges politics from an ethical, moral point of view. It's not about power plays here. That's what politics is about. But political philosophy is not about how things really work in the world, but how they ought to work in the world if people really were interested in doing the right thing or in justice. And her point is that that justice requires, unless structure like biological sex means nothing, then if it doesn't mean nothing, if it means nothing, then again, we do have structure. As I said earlier, and I wasn't joking, it's thinking about thought experiments. What about having your representatives live in a different country from you, speak a different languages? There are people I'm sure in Europe who share my political views more closely than people in the United States. Why don't they represent me in government? What's the point of them even having to live in the same country, if not because there's some epistemic affinity? This is what we're getting at. You have a perspective on the world that is determined by things like your gender, your geography, your race, your language, your culture, your religion, and so on. These do matter. They don't determine any given decision, but they are real, and some are more powerful than others. And her point was simply that among all the things that sort people out, sex is one of the most powerful ones. And it doesn't mean that there would be huge differences. There would be subtle differences, like you said, on issues that were very specifically female, like, for example, the abortion issue in the United States. If half of the government was female, many people predict that there would be a national law. We wouldn't have to be worrying about Roe v. Wade. There would be a constitutional amendment out there that would guarantee women the right to have an abortion. even though there are many, many, many women who are against abortion, that's what likely would happen. So in really, what voice should men have on that issue anyway, since they will never in their life be faced with a decision to even consider an abortion themselves. But even on issues that are not specifically sex related, like how much spending is spent on, say, domestic affairs versus foreign affairs, on the military versus education and healthcare, there are differences there that are tied to sex and gender. And that's been studied by sociologists. So those would affect how, or likely would be affected by such a structural change that would require women be in positions of power at least half the time. Anyway, that's her argument. But yeah. So anyway, Joan, you're there. Go ahead.
Yes, yeah, I do believe that representation is really important, and there cannot be democracy without representation. Democracy is letting the people have the power. If those people do not have people who represent them, in case of a representative democracy, it cannot be called democracy. And now when we are talking about the topic of the identity of the people who are in power, whether they are representing or no, I think Jamal explained it quite good. It won't matter if the person in power is a woman, is a Black person, because that person will very likely do not represent the interest of the people who is supposed to. Parties are using right now these kinds of identity politics in order to drive votes. And the person that's being selected for representing is nothing more than a facade. A kind of identity that's not being represented at all in politics is the kind of the one regarding owning means of production or not. Almost everyone, like every decision that's taken in Parliament is regarding production, right? And you mentioned that the difference in sex, for example, implies also a difference of what you worry about. And mentioned that I think on the third position was healthcare. Everyone agrees on healthcare. But it's not profitable to have healthcare for everyone. And I believe there is a need for systemic change that won't it won't rain from the sky.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Bill, you want to say something again? Go ahead. You have your hand up. You there? Okay. What time is it? Yeah, we're getting close to being done here, but unless somebody else wants to say something, I'm just going to go look at the comments. I haven't been paying attention to all the comments here, the chat part, in case. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Somebody mentions the identity politics. I think was it Mike? Yeah. Yeah. What Akasinski is talking about is what nowadays it's got. She wrote this I think 15 years ago. Yeah, it's called identity politics these days, except that not all identity, her point was that not all forms of identity politics are equal. So there's a hierarchy in terms of it. There's a type of feminist theory called standpoint theory, which argues that we all inhabit a place in the world. We're looking at the world from a particular location. It's a combination of culture, race, geography, language, nationality, everything you could imagine, that all the differences that sort people out. But among them all, her argument was that nothing colors our perspective on the world more deeply or more than our physiology. Because we're faced with different forces acting on us and that are causing us to care about either slightly different things or care differently about the same things. That was the whole point of bringing that up. It's there are types of identity that are relatively mutable and superficial, like street address, for example. I mean, we're not tied to our street address for life, but most of us are going to be tied to our sex, biological sex for life. So that was that. That was what that was all about. But if we had a representative government, it seems, she had a point, I think. And of course, as Bill suggested, there would still be the same pressures on women, even if we did have such a system where they had half the power there was to be had, to conform to the whatever the people with the power want them to do. They would, if they wanted to stay in office, they would have to toe a line of some sort. Anyway, I'm going to wind up this discussion for today, but for those of us who are still here, thank you all for sticking it out this far. And just a preview, I'll be putting up a write-up for the next part, which is going to be focusing on elections and voting. And if there wasn't enough problems with representation, it actually gets even worse with voting. There are three major motivations for why people vote in an election, or three. Yeah, one of them is because people believe that their individual vote makes a difference to a political outcome. Emphasize individual vote. And statistically, the answer is no, it doesn't. Not even, and what people have in mind is something like this, like suppose that there was an election in the United States where, just for the sake of simplicity, say there were 2 million voters in the United States, 2,000,001 voters. And 1 million of them voted for one candidate for president, and another million voted for the other one. And you were that one, and you were the tiebreaker. So if you decided not to vote, your vote if you had voted, it would have made a huge difference. You would have decided the election. Does that ever happen in the real world, in on large scale elections? And the answer is no. It's not even theoretically possible. And we have a historical example of something, the old 2000 election involving Bush and Gore. What happens? It's like the electoral process is like an instrument that doesn't have a high enough resolution, like a telescope. You're looking at something distant, and you see a fuzzy, looking at some star, a planet around some other star, and you see a fuzzy thing there, but you can't tell the details of what the surface of the planet looks like, because the instrument you have isn't strong enough. Well, voting can't handle that level of resolution that you can decide when it's one person's vote, it would make a difference. Even if it were 100 or 1,000 different votes that would have made a difference, as in fact was the case in the famous 2000 election involving Bush-Gore, where one district in Florida was, what's going to happen whenever anything gets anywhere near close to an election on a national scale is there going to be recounts and recounts and recounts, and every count is going to be different than the one before. It's going to be thrown into the courts. And yes, one vote does make a difference if you're sitting on the Supreme Court, because that's what happened then. The Supreme Court decided the election. So, but your individual vote, whether you vote one way or another or don't vote at all, could not even theoretically make a difference to an outcome of an election at a large scale. But that's not the only reason to vote. There are at least two other votes, and I think the second one is the one that most people think is. I'm going over these quickly, but we'll talk about these in great detail next time. And the second one is known as block voting, and this is where you don't really think that your vote by itself is going to make a difference, but you do think that this larger group of, say, the Democrats or the Republicans that you identify with, your vote helps that block win the election. And if that block wins the election, you get at least something of what you want because you sympathize with that block. Okay, but then this problem, this block voting idea is exactly what we've been talking about today, about representation. your perspective has to be, you have to be in line with to one of these two options. It's not like individually your vote doesn't matter, but only if your vote conforms to one of two. If it homogenizes, it mixes in well with either the Democrats or the Republicans. Then, only then, does your vote actually help in a very tiny way your bloc. The problem with that is, of course, what we've been talking about today, and that is that, well, is that it? Is that a choice between two things is better than no choice at all, but only by one single number. It's about as close to having no choice at all as you can get it without actually having no choice at all. And that's the representation problem we're talking about this time. And then there's a third reason. And the third reason is one where this magical thinking comes into play. And that is it could be that the reason people vote is not to do because they really believe their individual vote matters much, or that even they don't really deeply identify with this group or another, but because it may help them sleep better. They feel they're doing their duty. They're engaging in an almost religious ritual, a magical event that makes them feel they're part of something bigger than themselves. It does something for them psychologically to vote. The problem with that motivation, and there's nothing to stop people from having more than one of these motivations, they could have all three. But the problem with this last one is it has nothing to do with the real, governance. It's largely a personal thing. You're doing this because it makes you feel good about yourself. And what does that have to do with making good governance? And it's so no matter what your motivation for voting is, there are problems with it. And anyway, but I'm sure there are people who disagree with this, and we'll talk more about the arguments on both sides of this next time. So anyway, I'm going to stop right now, but I want to thank it.
Are you going to, Victor? Are you going to cover the election denier movement? It seems like a favorite trick with the populists. As soon as the populist loses, the populist claims that it was all rigged.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the thing is that whenever the problem is if we have elections that are, unless they're overwhelming landslides, where it's very clear most people wanted this person or that person, then you're going to have accusations and counter accusations of rigged elections and vote fraud and on and on. And there's no way in which the electoral system can solve those problems because it just isn't an instrument that's properly fine-tuned, doesn't have the right resolution to solve these things because it's too complex, too big, the numbers are too big. There's plenty of room for real error on both sides, and it ends up in the Supreme Court. And yeah, this is why democracy works very well in small groups, when you can see the other people in your group and know where they stand. But when you're talking about millions and millions of people, the whole situation is so fuzzy that unless it's an overwhelming majority for one side or the other, anything close leaves you. It's going to be decided by the Supreme Court. It's what happened in 2020.
I guess what I'm saying is, if the politician is a populist of the Trump sort, if it's close, they are guaranteed to claim the election was rigged.
Of course.
I don't think you don't see that on the liberal side.
Well, I think you would see it. Although I have to admit, back in 2020, Gore, in fact, he was criticized for this. He conceded rather quickly. Some people think he conceded way too quickly. He should have, he was, in a way, he was being an honest. Says, okay, I'm not going to fight this forever. Okay, the Supreme Court said this. I'm not going to. He could have continued to fight. He gave up too soon, and maybe that spoke to his somewhat integrity he had. But so I can see what you mean, but that's a very a personal thing, and I have no idea what. Anyway, you're right, but anyway, we're going to talk a lot more about this next time. Okay, And I'll put up some reading material and some stuff for people to think about and watch too, because there are some even more radical ideas about voting, which I won't talk about now because
Can I just add one thing, please? Can I just add
Yes,
one
go
thing?
ahead.
You know,
Yes, go ahead.
I really just don't really like to perpetuate talk that increases division between the parties. And I think Carrie Lake really was the only person who made a big fuss over her loss. But if you go back to Abrams over there in Georgia, when she lost to Kemp, I think that was in 2018, she has never conceded that election. So it's not just the Republicans. I mean, Trump was horrible, I agree. That was over the top, way over the top. But I think it's kind of important to realize that sometimes the Democrats also have not conceded and also have objected to electoral votes when the Congress was meeting to do that particular job. So it is a little bit of both parties. And frankly, I mean, that's okay, as long as you do it within the law, that you follow the proper procedure where you do recounts. You know, yeah, you can take it to the Supreme Court. You're allowed to do that. But if you lose, that's when you have to accept that you've lost.
Right. Thanks a lot, Brenda. That's a great comment. We'll be talking more about this aspect of the whole problem next time. And anyway, thanks again, everybody, for coming, and hope you're back next time. Okay?
Thanks a lot. Good work.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Victor.
Yeah.
Thank you. See you next week.
Okay, bye.
When's the next one, Victor?
It'll be posted soon. It's going to be next month, but I'll be posting it if you'll be getting an email about it soon. Okay.
Okay, then
Okay.
see you next month.
Sure. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.